everyone, it's Molly. Welcome to Teen Book Talk Tuesday. On Tuesdays we will discuss some of the new young adult books to the library, and I'll talk about ones that I have read. I'll talk about ones I haven't read just to kind of promote some of our new books. And if you're interested in any of the books that we have in, feel free to call the library and put them on hold and we will surely get those to you. So first, I'm going to talk about some books. After that, though, I'm going to read a short story. And for the month of Halloween, I'll do a scary short story every week on Teen Book Talk Tuesday after our book discussion. So, the first book that I am going to talk to you guys about that I actually just finished. It took me a while to read it. I just hadn't been reading a whole lot lately, but we all kind of get in that book reading funk once in a while. So, the first one I have here is called All the Stars and Teeth, and it's by Adeline Grace. This is one that I did read and I thought it was really good. This book actually came out in November, or not November, I'm sorry. It came out in February of this year, but we got it in September, so that's how long I had to read it for. So basically, in this book, the setting is the Kingdom of Visigia, which is made up of 7 different islands, and they are all listed in the book on one of the first few pages. First I'll show you there's actually a cool map in the beginning of the book. It's the whole Kingdom of Visigia and all of its islands, neighboring islands. Now each island is very special. Each island actually practices their own type of magic, and each island is represented by a gemstone. So we have the first kingdom, which is Arida, and this is where our main character, Amora Montara, comes from. She is the princess of all of Visigia, and she lives in Arida, which is the island that practices soul magic. And they are represented by a sapphire. And I'll explain a little bit about what the soul magic is, because that's a big part of this book. Next you have the island of Valuka, which is an island of elemental magic. So you have people that specialize in water, earth, fire magic. If you know about Avatar: The Next Airbender, if you were ever a fan of that show, you could kind of think of it like that. They all practice different elemental magic. And they're represented by a ruby. And Valuka is actually where our main character, Amora, Princess Amora, her mother is actually from Valuka, so she used to practice water magic. There's the island of Mornut, which is an island of enchantment magic. So making your hair a different color, enchanting one thing to look like another, stuff like that. And they're represented by a rose beryl type of gemstone, so it's kind of like it has a rosy color to it, I imagine. Then there's Karmana, the island of mind magic. Magic of the mind, making people think or see things that aren't really there. Mind trickery type of magic, and they're represented by an onyx, which is a black stone. There's Karast, which is the island of time magic. They can bend time, freeze time, do stuff really, really fast, like the speed of light kind of thing. And they're represented by an amethyst, which is a purple gemstone, if you've ever seen an amethyst. There's Sentoso, which is the island of restoration magic, which is healing magic. People there, they can actually regenerate limbs, which is pretty cool. If they lose an arm, they can regenerate it. And then there's Zudo, the 7th island, which is the island of curse magic, and they're represented by an opal. Now Zudo is actually an island that has been banished, so that's part of the main conflict of the story. They have been banished for reasons that are unknown to Princess Amora. Her father, the king, never told her why they were banished. She just knows that they are basically against everything that the Montara bloodline is for. They're against everything that they believe, basically. So we've talked about the setting of the story. Like I said, it takes place in the Kingdom of Visigia. So we have our characters. So there's Amora Montara. She is the Princess of Visigia. She's training to be the High Animancer. High Animancer is basically the master of soul magic. Whoever rules Visigia, they're from Arita. They're always from Arita, which is the island of soul magic. And the king or queen, whoever comes into power, has to be a master of soul magic. This basically makes them like a hardcore executioner for the kingdom, because with soul magic you can kill someone, which is kind of what Amora is dealing with as she becomes the king of Visigia, or queen of Visigia, I'm sorry. So she's training to be the High Animancer. So she right now is kind of playing executioner until she takes the throne. She uses bones, blood, and hair of the victims, and she uses these in order to do the soul magic, in order to execute them by throwing bones or blood or hair into fire, and in this way she is able to kind of destroy them. But on the bright side, she does pick people that are really, really, really just evil people, and the way that she can determine how evil that they are, how far from redemption they are, is that she has the ability to look into someone's soul. So with soul magic, that's one other thing that she can do. She can look at someone and see into their soul, and she can see how dark it has become, how rotted it's become, you know, if it's no longer pretty, you know, soul full of light. So then this way she can tell, well, if this person is just beyond saving, then off to the executioner's fire that they go. Okay, and then we have Ferric, who is actually engaged to Amora. He is from the island of restoration magic, so he is able to regenerate his limbs and things like that. So basically him and her are a good match. That's why they were put together in the first place. If you have someone who can regenerate their limbs and bones, and someone who needs that to do her magic, you have a perfect pair there, I assume. So they're engaged, but you'll see in the story that Amora just isn't in love with him. She's just not focused on finding love at this point. She's more focused on becoming the leader of Visigia, and the fact that there's a lot of things being kept secret from her. So she's really not focused on love until later on in the story. I'm not going to give anything away, but then you have Bastion, who is the captain of Keelhaul, which is a ship that Amora and the crew, they use this ship to get to Zudo, which is their main goal, which I will talk about the conflict. So Bastion's the captain of Keelhaul, and then you have Vatea, who is a mermaid that assists Amora, Ferric, and Bastion later on in the story. She was actually being held captive by some evil dudes. So they find her and they save her because she's going to help them with her sea magic. Because mermaids in the story are basically sirens in this story. If you don't know what a siren is in mythology, it's a sea creature, normally female, who lures people and kills them, mostly sea captains or, you know. So then we have the conflict. Now the main conflict is that basically you have the island of Zudo, which has been banished. They are in deep trouble because they've been taken over by an evil man named Caven, who practices kind of a new type of magic. It's a combination between cursed magic and soul magic, where he is able to curse someone's soul, to curse them to an object in some way using their blood. So he's taken over the island of Zudo, and Amora finds out why Zudo was banished, and it has a lot to do with this guy and with their leaders. Basically, they want to be able to practice any kind of magic that they want because the king of Visigia has banned using multiple magics, which is why you have different islands who use a different type of magic. And Caven, the leader of Zudo at this point, he thinks everybody should do whatever they want, but he's evil, so he has very bad intentions. So basically, Amora is off to save Zudo, find out the truth behind her soul magic and why other people aren't allowed to practice it. And along the way, they face a lot of trials. They face, you know, a evil sea creature, deadly sea creature, things like that. Friendships are formed between Amora, Vatea, Ferric, and Bastion. So you have friendship, you have them getting through trials together, there's magic, there's fighting, there is violence, there is a little bit of romance. There's not anything that's too steamy, but you know, of course, there's that little element in there that some of us enjoy in our books. So that is the main gist of All the Stars and Teeth. And like I said, I really enjoyed that book. I'm a huge fan of fantasy, so a lot of the books I talk about are going to be fantasy related, and they are going to be young adult. So basically with that book, if you like pirates, if you like mermaids, if you like magic, you should definitely give that book a try. And it is a new series. Like I said, this one came out in February. There's a second book called All the Tides of Fate, which will be coming out next year in 2021. So the next book I want to talk about, and I'm just going to discuss these briefly. This one I did read as well, and this is a fairly new series. It's called The Twisted Tales, and this is the only one that I have read, but there are quite a few in the series. Basically, they are our classic fairy tales, our Disney fairy tales, and there's a twist to them. So this one is called Once Upon a Dream, and this one is If Sleeping Beauty Never Woke Up. So in this book, you have Sleeping Beauty. She's been asleep this whole entire time. She's basically, you know, in this dream world in her mind that Maleficent is keeping her held captive in, and everyone else in the kingdom. So basically, when she fell asleep, everybody fell asleep. Then the prince tried to kiss her and wake her up, then he fell asleep. He's in this world with her, and they are fighting Maleficent as they try and figure out how to wake Princess Aurora. So that is a great series you should also try if you're a Disney fan and if you're a fantasy fan. This one here is called Foretold, and it's 14 stories of prophecy and prediction. So if you are a fan of prophecy, stories that have to do with prophecy, you should definitely give this one a try. This is by a lot of different authors. It's edited by Carrie Ryan. Some of the authors in this are Rochelle Mead, Lisa McMahon, Laini Taylor. Laini Taylor, I love Laini Taylor. Anything by her is amazing. I highly recommend Laini Taylor. Meg Cabot and more. There's a lot of popular authors in this book, so I highly recommend this one. You know, and there's a lot of good stories in here. A lot of stories that teach you a lesson, a lot of stories that are just for entertainment. There are a lot of dark stories, a lot of love stories, so that's definitely one you should try. And we got this one in May, and it is a fairly new book. I believe it came out this year. Here is another series. It's another twisted kind of Disney series, and it is young adult and a little bit of an easier read. They're not that big, but I've heard they're very good. I actually haven't read these. I'll read one and I'll let you guys know about it in one of our future videos, but this is about the Disney villains. This one is called Poor Unfortunate Soul. And let me just read you some of the synopsis of this. So the tale of the Sea King's daughter Ariel is a beloved one of losing and then finding one's own voice. The story has been told many times and in many ways, but always the mergirl wants more than her world can offer, and her father demands that she live within the confines of his domain. Her rebelliousness costs the little mermaid her voice and nearly her soul, but the power of good prevails and Ariel emerges proud and changed. And yet this is only half the story. So what of Ariel's nemesis, Ursula, the sea witch? What led her to becoming so twisted, scorned, and filled with hatred? Many tales have tried to explain her motives. Here is one account of what might have shaped the sea witch into a detestable and poor unfortunate soul. So it's a backstory of the villain, and I believe that that's the case with each different story. So I'm going to give this a try, and I suggest you guys give it a try as well, and maybe put in the comments what you think about this book. Lastly, this is a new one. If any of you are Twilight fans, I actually haven't read the Twilight books, but I've been hearing a little bit about this. It's Midnight Sun, and it is the new Twilight book, and this is actually told from Edward's point of view, and if you read the synopsis, that tells you that as well. So if you're a Twilight fan, I recommend giving it a try. And we do have this at the library. All of these books are available to check out right now, so if you want them, please call us or email us and we will get those put on hold for you. So that concludes our book talk for today, and next up I am going to read the short story, The Lottery. It's a creepy one, and I have not read it, so I'm going to be just as shocked as you or just as creeped out as you while I'm reading it. So I'm going to read that to you guys, and so every week after our book talks, I'm going to read a short story. So let's read The Lottery. Okay, so I turned the lights down to make it a little bit creepier. So here we go. The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. Did not tell you the author. And there are, I think, some illustrations in here, and I'll show those to you throughout. Okay, here we go. The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely and the grass was richly green. The people of the village began to gather in the square between the post office and the bank around 10 o'clock. In some towns, there were so many people that the lottery took 2 days and had to be started on June 26th. But in this village, where there were only about 300 people, the whole lottery took less than 2 hours. So it could begin at 10 o'clock in the morning and still be through in time to allow the villagers to get home for noon dinner. The children assembled first, of course. School was recently over the summer, and the feeling of liberty sat uneasily on most of them. They tended to gather together quietly for a while before they broke into boisterous play, and their talk was still of the classroom and the teacher, of books and reprimands. Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones, and the other boys soon followed his example, selecting the smoothest and roundest stones. Bobby and Harry Jones and Dickie Delacroix, the villagers pronounced his name Delacroix, eventually made a great pile of stones in one corner of the square and guarded it against the raids of the other boys. The girls stood aside, talking among themselves, looking over their shoulders at the boys, and the very small children rolled in the dust or clung to the hands of their older brothers or sisters. Soon the men began to gather, surveying their own children, speaking of planting and rain, tractors and taxes. They stood together away from the pile of stones in the corner, and their jokes were quiet, and they smiled rather than laughed. The women, wearing faded house dresses and sweaters, came shortly after their menfolk. They greeted one another and exchanged bits of gossip as they went to join their husbands. Soon the women, standing by their husbands, began to call to their children, and the children came reluctantly, having to be called 4 or 5 times. Bobby Martin ducked under his mother's grasping hand and ran, laughing, back to the pile of stones. His father spoke up sharply, and Bobby came quickly and took his place between his father and his older brother. The lottery was conducted, as were the square dances, the teenage club, the Halloween program, by Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities. He was a round-faced man, jovial man, and he ran the coal business, and people were sorry for him because he had no children and his wife was a scold. When he arrived in the square, carrying the black wooden box, there was a murmur of conversation among the villagers, and he waved and called, "Little late today, folks." The postmaster, Mr. Graves, followed him carrying a 3-legged stool, and the stool was put in the center of the square, and Mr. Summers set the black box down on it. The villagers kept their distance, leaving a space between themselves and the stool, and when Mr. Summers said, "Some of you fellows want to give me a hand?" there was a hesitation before 2 men, Mr. Martin and his oldest son Baxter, came forward to hold the box steady on the stool while Mr. Summers stirred up the papers inside it. The original paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago, and the black box now resting on the stool had been put into use before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in town, was born. Mr. Summers spoke frequently to the villagers about making a new box, but no one liked to upset even as much tradition as was represented by the black box. There was a story that the present box had been made with some pieces of the box that had preceded it, the one that had been constructed when the first people settled down to make a village here. Every year after the lottery, Mr. Summers began talking again about a new box, but every year the subject was allowed to fade off without anything being done. The black box grew shabbier each year. By now it was no longer completely black, but splintered badly along one side to show the original wood color, and in some places faded or stained. Mr. Martin and his oldest son Baxter held the black box securely on the stool until Mr. Summers had stirred the papers thoroughly with his hand. Because so much of the ritual had been forgotten or discarded, Mr. Summers had been successful in having slips of paper substituted for the chips of wood that had been used for generations. Chips of wood, Mr. Summers had argued, had been all very well when the village was tiny, but now that the population was more than 300 and likely to keep on growing, it was necessary to use something that would fit more easily into the black box. The night before the lottery, Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves made up the slips of paper and put them in the box, and it was then taken to the safe of Mr. Summers' coal company and locked up until Mr. Summers was ready to take it to the square next morning. The rest of the year the box was put away, sometimes one place, sometimes another. It had spent 1 year in Mr. Graves' barn and another year underfoot in the post office, and sometimes it was set on a shelf in the Martin grocery and left there. There was a great deal of fussing to be done before Mr. Summers declared the lottery open. There were the lists to make up, the heads of families, heads of households in each family, member of each household in each family. There was the proper swearing in of Mr. Summers by the postmaster as the official of the lottery. At one time, some people remembered there had been a recital of some sort, performed by the official of the lottery, a perfunctory, tuneless chant that had been rattled off duly each year. Some people believed that the official of the lottery used to stand just so when he said or sang it. Others believed that he was supposed to walk among the people, but years and years ago, this part of the ritual had been allowed to lapse. There had been also a ritual salute, which the official of the lottery had had to use in addressing each person who came up to draw from the box. But this also had changed in time. Until now it was felt necessary only for the official to speak to each person approaching. Mr. Summers was very good at all this. In its clean white shirt and blue jeans, with one hand resting carelessly on the black box, he seemed very proper and important as he talked interminably to Mr. Graves and the Martins. Just as Mr. Summers finally left off talking and turned to the assembled villagers, Mrs. Hutchinson came hurriedly along the path to the square, her sweater thrown over her shoulders, and slid into the place in the back of the crowd. "Clean forgot what day it was," she said to Mrs. Delacroix, who stood next to her, and they both laughed softly. "Thought my old man was back out stacking wood," Mrs. Hutchinson went on, "and then I looked out the window and the kids was gone, and then I remembered it was the 27th and came a-running." She dried her hands on her apron, and Mrs. Delacroix said, "You're in time, though. They're still talking away up there." Mrs. Hutchinson craned her neck to see through the crowd and found her husband and children standing near the front. She tapped Mrs. Delacroix on the arm as a farewell and began to make her way through the crowd. The people separated good-humoredly to let her through. 2 or 3 people said, in voices just loud enough to be heard across the crowd, "Here comes your Mrs. Hutchinson." And Bill, she made it after all. Mrs. Hutchinson reached her husband, and Mr. Summers, who had been waiting, said cheerfully, "Thought we were going to have to get on without you, Tessie." Mrs. Hutchinson said, grinning, Mrs. Hutchinson said, grinning, "Wouldn't have me leave my dishes in the sink now, would you, Joe?" And soft laughter ran through the crowd as the people stirred back into position after Mrs. Hutchinson's arrival. "Well now," Mr. Summers said soberly, "guess we better get started, get this over with so's we can get back to work. Anybody ain't here?" "Dunbar," several people said. "Dunbar, Dunbar." Mr. Summers consulted his list. "Clyde Dunbar," he said. "That's right, he's broke his leg, hasn't he? Who's drawing for him?" "Me, I guess," a woman said, and Mr. Summers turned to look at her. "Wife draws for her husband," Mr. Summers said. "Don't you have a grown boy to do it for you, Janie?" Although Mr. Summers and everyone else in the village knew the answer perfectly well, it was the business of the official of the lottery to ask such questions formally. Mr. Summers waited with an expression of polite interest while Mrs. Dunbar answered. "Horace is not but 16 yet," Mrs. Dunbar said regretfully. "Guess I gotta fill in for the old man this year." "Right," Mr. Summers said. He made a note on the list he was holding. Then he asked, "Watson boy drawing this year?" A tall boy in the crowd raised his hands. "Here," he said. "I'm drawing for my mother and me." He blinked his eyes nervously and ducked his head as several voices in the crowd said things like, "Good fellow, Jack," and "Glad to see your mother's got a man to do it." And here's an illustration. It's Mrs. Hutchinson reached her husband, and Mr. Summers, who had been waiting cheerfully, said, "Thought we were going to get on without you." So that's that part of the story. There's an illustration for that. "Well," Mr. Summers said, "guess that's everyone. Old man Warner make it?" "Here," a voice said, and Mr. Summers nodded. A sudden hush fell on the crowd as Mr. Summers cleared his throat and looked at the list. "All ready?" he called. "Now I'll read the names, heads of families first, and the men come up and take a paper out of the box. Keep the paper folded in your hand without looking at it until everyone has had a turn. Everything clear?" The people had done it so many times that they only half listened to the directions. Most of them were quiet, wetting their lips, not looking around. Then Mr. Summers raised one hand high and said, "Adams." A man disengaged himself from the crowd and came forward. "Hi, Steve," Mr. Summers said, and Mr. Adams said, "Hi, Joe." They grinned at one another humorlessly and nervously. Then Mr. Adams reached into the black box and took out a folded paper. He held it firmly by one corner as he turned and went hastily back to his place in the crowd where he stood a little apart from his family, not looking down at his hand. "Allen," Mr. Summers said, "Anderson, Bentham." "Seems like there's no time at all between lotteries anymore," Mrs. Delacroix said to Mrs. Graves in the back row. "Seems like we get through this with the last one only last week." "Time sure goes fast," Mrs. Graves said. "Clark, Delacroix, there goes my old man," said Mrs. Delacroix. She held her breath while her husband went forward. "Dunbar," said Mr. Summers, and Mrs. Dunbar went steadily to the box while one of the women said, "Go on, Janie," and another said, "There she goes." "Where next?" Mrs. Graves said. She watched while Mr. Graves came around from the side of the box, greeted Mr. Summers gravely, and selected a slip of paper from the box. By now, all through the crowd, there were men holding the small folded papers in their large hands, turning them over and over nervously. Mrs. Dunbar and her two sons stood together, Mrs. Dunbar holding the slip of paper. "Harbert, Hutchinson, get up there, Bill," Mrs. Hutchinson said, and the people near her laughed. "Jones, they do say," Mr. Adams said to the old man Warner, who stood next to him, "that over in the North Village they're talking of giving up the lottery." Old man Warner snorted. "Pack of crazy fools," he said. "Listening to the young folks, nothing's good enough for them. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back to living in caves, nobody work anymore, live that way for a while. Used to be saying about lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'd all be eating stewed chicken seed and acorns. There's always been a lottery," he added petulantly. "Bad enough to see young Joe Summers up there joking with everybody." "Some places have already quit lotteries," Mrs. Adams said. "Nothing but trouble in that," old man Warner said stoutly. "Pack of young fools." Martin and Bobby Martin watched his father go forward. "Overdyke, Percy, I wish they'd hurry," Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. "I wish they'd hurry." "They're almost through," her son said. "You get ready to run tell Dad," Mrs. Dunbar said. Mr. Summers called his own name and then stepped forward precisely and selected a slip from the box. Then he called, "Warner?" 77th year I've been in that lottery," old man Warner said as he went through the crowd. 77th time. "Watson?" The tall boy came awkwardly through the crowd. Someone said, "Don't be nervous, Jack," and Mr. Summers said, "Take your time, son." "Zanini?" After that, there was a long pause, a breathless pause, until Mr. Summers, holding a slip of paper in the air, said, "All right, fellows." For a minute, no one moved, and then all the slips of paper were opened. Suddenly, all the women began to speak at once, saying, "Who is it? Who is it? Is it the Dunbars? Is it the Watsons?" Then the voices began to say, "It's Hutchinson. It's Bill. Bill Hutchinson's got it." "Go tell your father," Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. People began to look around to see the Hutchinsons. Bill Hutchinson was standing quiet, staring down at the paper in his hand. Suddenly, Tessie Hutchinson shouted to Mr. Summers, "You didn't give him enough time to take any paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair." "Be a good sport, Tessie," Mrs. Delacroix called, and Mrs. Graves said, "All of us took the same chance." "Shut up, Tessie," Bill Hutchinson said. "Well, everyone," Mr. Summers said, "that was done pretty fast, and now we've got to be hurrying a little more to get done in time." He consulted his next list. "Bill," he said, "you draw for the Hutchinson family. You got any other households in the Hutchinsons?" "There's Dawn and Eva," Mrs. Hutchinson yelled. "Make them make their chance." "Daughters draw with their husbands' families, Tessie," Mr. Summers said gently. "You know that as well as anyone else." "It wasn't fair," Tessie said. "I guess not, Joe," Bill Hutchinson said regretfully. "My daughter draws with her husband's family. That's only fair. And I've got no other family except the kids." "Then as far as drawing for families is concerned, it's you," Mr. Summers said in explanation. "And as far as drawing for households is concerned, that's you too, right?" "Right," Bill Hutchinson said. "How many kids, Bill?" Mr. Summers asked formally. "3, Bill Hutchinson said. "There's Bill Jr. and Nancy and little Dave and Tessie and me." "All right then," Mr. Summers said. "Harry, you got their tickets back?" Mr. Graves nodded and held up the slips of paper. "Put them in the box then," Mr. Summers directed. "Take Bill's and put it in." "I think we ought to start over," Mrs. Hutchinson said, and as quietly as she could. "I told you it wasn't fair. You didn't give him enough time to choose. Everybody saw that." Mr. Graves had selected the 5 slips and put them in the box, and he dropped all the papers but those onto the ground where the breeze caught them and lifted them off. "Listen, everybody," Mrs. Hutchinson was saying to the people around her. "Ready, Bill?" Mr. Summers asked, and Bill Hutchinson, with one quick glance around at his wife and children, nodded. And here is an illustration of Mrs. Hutchinson saying that it wasn't fair that Bill got chosen. I wonder why she doesn't think it's fair. It's the lotteries. You would think that's a good thing. "Remember," Mr. Summers said, "take the slips and keep them folded until each person has taken one. Harry, you help little Dave." Mr. Graves took the hand of the little boy who came willingly with him up to the box. "Take a paper out of the box, Davy," Mr. Summers said. Davy put his hand into the box and laughed. "Take just one paper," Mr. Summers said. "Harry, you hold it for him." Mr. Graves took the child's hand and removed the folded paper from the tight fist and held it, while little Dave stood next to him and looked up at him wonderingly. "Nancy next," Mr. Summers said. Nancy was 12, and her school friends breathed heavily as she went forward, switching her skirt, and took a slip daintily from the box. "Bill Jr.," Mr. Summers said, and Billy, his face red and his feet overlarge, nearly knocked the box over as he got a paper out. "Tessie," Mr. Summers said. She hesitated for a minute, looking around defiantly, and then set her lips and went up to the box. She snatched a paper out and held it behind her. "Bill," Mr. Summers said, and Bill Hutchinson reached into the box and felt around, bringing his hand out at last with the slip of paper in it. The crowd was quiet. A girl whispered, "I hope it's not Nancy," and the sound of the whisper reached the edges of the crowd. "It's not the way it used to be," Old Man Warner said clearly. "People ain't the way they used to be." "All right," Mr. Summers said, "open the papers. Harry, you open little Dave's." Mr. Graves opened the slip of paper, and there was a general sigh through the crowd as he held it up, and everyone could see that it was blank. Nancy and Bill Jr. opened theirs at the same time, and both beamed and laughed, turning around to the crowd and holding their slips of paper above their heads. "Tessie," Mr. Summers said. There was a pause, and then Mr. Summers looked at Bill Hutchinson, and Bill unfolded his paper and showed it was blank. "It's Tessie," Mr. Summers said, and his voice was hushed. "Show us her paper, Bill." Bill Hutchinson went over to his wife and forced the slip of paper out of her hand. It had a black spot on it, the black spot Mr. Summers had made the night before with the heavy pencil in the coal company office. Bill Hutchinson held it up, and there was a stir in the crowd. "All right, folks," Mr. Summers said. "Let's finish quickly." Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use stones. The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready. There were stones on the ground with the blowing scraps of paper that had come out of the box. Mr. Delacroix selected a stone so large she had to pick it up with both hands and turned to Mrs. Dunbar. "Come on," she said. "Hurry up." Mrs. Dunbar had small stones in both hands, and she said, gasping for breath, "I can't run at all. You'll have to go ahead and I'll catch up with you." The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a cleared space by now. and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair," she said. A stone hit her on the side of the head. Old Man Warner was saying, come on, everyone." Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of villagers, with Mrs. Graves behind him. "It isn't fair, it isn't right," Mrs. Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her. And then here is another illustration of Shirley Jackson, actually, the author, there at the end of the book. It's Shirley Jackson. Well, that was an interesting story. If you didn't understand the story, this lottery was a drawing, and whoever won got stoned, which is how I took that, since Tessie, everybody grabbed stones, and Tessie kept screaming how it wasn't fair, and she had a stone hit her in the head. So that is a very creepy story, and I hope that you enjoyed it. And so we will have another short story next week after we talk about our books, after we have our book talk on Tuesday for our Tuesday Teen Book Talk. So tune in next Tuesday.